At exactly 11:11 p.m. amid the chilling Seattle rain, I received the message. This year, there's no room for you at Ironwood Hall. Your father needs space for important stakeholders. And the one who had silently paid $12,482 in taxes to save the entire family estate was coldly kicked out by my own parents from the very table I had helped fund. That night, I didn't cry. I smirked, and I decided if I'm not invited to sit, I'll build a far more powerful, luxurious table, and force my entire family to kneel begging for just one spare seat. The Seattle rain was relentless, a persistent gray mist that blurred the jagged skyline beyond my studio window. Inside, the atmosphere was a deliberate sanctuary. The air carried the heavy, sophisticated scent of charred ebony and dried herbs, me signature blend of blackwood and sage. It was a fragrance designed for focus for the kind of high-stakes branding work that required an iron will and a clear head. I was currently staring at a digital canvas fine-tuning the kerning of a logo for a boutique hotel in Aspen. The clinical, sterile glow of my dual LED monitors cast a sharp, bluish tint over my hands, making my skin look as cold as I felt. There was a precision to this space, an efficiency that left no room for the messy, uncurated chaos of human emotion. It was all function, no sentiment. At exactly 11:11 p.m., my smartphone vibrated against the polished walnut of my desk. The timing was a bitter irony. 11 and 11, the kind of number people swear means something. I reached for the device, the screen illuminating the dark room with an invasive brightness. It was a message from my mother, Sutton. I read the words slowly, allowing the weight of each character to sink into the hollow of my chest. Silas, your father and I have finalized the logistics for the Ironwood Hall retreat. With the sheer number of confirmed guests this year, 156 to be precise, there's simply no room left in the main house or the guest quarters. Your father believes it would be best if you sat this year out. We need the space for the new stakeholders and our primary partners. I am sure you understand. We will see you at the holiday dinner instead. I did not reply. I sat in the silence of my studio, listening to the rhythmic hum of my computer fans. The word stakeholders tasted like ash. My father, Thatcher, had always viewed our family as a corporate entity, and apparently I was the asset he was ready to liquidate. I set the phone down and let my gaze drift to the corner of my workstation, where a small plastic rectangle caught the light. It was a Starbucks gift card worth exactly $15. It had been my Christmas gift from them last year, handed to me in a generic envelope while my brothers Pierce and Knox unwrapped custom-tailored Italian leather jackets. They had laughed, calling it a practical gift for a busy designer. I had kept it as a reminder, not of their generosity, but of my place in their hierarchy. Slowly, I reached into my top drawer and pulled out another document to place beside that $15 card. It was a property tax assessment for Ironwood Hall totaling $12,482. 3 weeks ago, Thatcher had called me in a panic, claiming a temporary liquidity issue due to a late payment from a client. He had asked me to cover the tax bill to prevent a lien on the family estate. I had paid it immediately without question because that was what I believed family did for one another. The visual contrast was a physical blow, a $15 token of indifference sitting next to a $12,000 proof of my loyalty. The cold LED light of my monitor seemed to sharpen the edges of the papers, highlighting the absurdity of the situation. I had been funding the very table I was now being told I was not worthy to sit at. I had been the silent architect of their comfort, the invisible hand that kept the roof over their heads while they plotted to lock the doors against me. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the leather creaking in the stillness. The warmth I had always tried to find in my family, the soft glow of the fireplace at Ironwood Hall, the laughter over shared meals, now felt like a cheap theatrical prop. It was a fake warmth, a curated image designed for social media and the elite circles Thatcher moved in. It was a facade, built on the labor of the one person they refused to acknowledge. If they do not invite you to their table, build your own. My grandfather, Wilder Sterling, had whispered those words to me when I was a child, long before Thatcher had turned our heritage into a transaction. At the time, I did not understand the gravity of that advice. I thought it was a metaphor for creativity. Now, staring at the rain-streaked window of my Seattle studio, I realized it was a blueprint for survival. I clicked the power button on my monitors. The sterile blue light vanished, plunging the room into darkness, save for the faint orange embers of a candle burning low on the shelf. The silence was no longer heavy. It was a blank canvas. I reached for my laptop and opened a private browser tab. I was done waiting for an invitation that was never going to come. I was done being the benefactor of my own exclusion. If Thatcher wanted a retreat that focused on stakeholders and power, I would give him exactly that. But it would not be under his roof, and it would not be on his terms. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of blackwood and sage. The plan began to take shape with the clarity of a high-resolution render. By the time the sun rose over the Puget Sound, the foundation of Indigo Reach would be laid. I was no longer a son looking for a seat. I was a founder preparing for a takeover. The gray dawn of Seattle did not bring sleep. It brought a cold, crystalline clarity. I sat at my desk and dialed a number that was not in my frequent contacts but was etched into the psychological foundation of my career. Alaric Thorne answered on the second ring. Alaric was a titan of the venture capital world and the mentor who had taught me that a brand is not a logo but a promise kept under pressure. "Silas," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone that commanded immediate attention even through a digital connection. "It is early. Either you are in trouble or you are about to change the world." "I am liquidating my personal venture fund, Alaric," I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "I need you to bridge the capital gap for a short-term acquisition. I am not merely building a retreat. I am establishing a new standard of influence. I am moving against Ironwood Hall." I explained the vision. I did not want the crumbling ivy-covered walls of my father's estate. Ironwood Hall represented the past Thatcher's obsession with inherited status, dusty traditions, and a suffocating lack of transparency. I wanted Indigo Reach. It was a masterpiece of glass steel and basalt perched on a jagged cliff overlooking the Sound. It was architectural minimalism at its finest, a space where the horizon was the only limit and the walls did not hide secrets. While Ironwood was a fortress of the old world, Indigo Reach was a beacon of the new. Alaric listened, the silence on the other end of the line heavy with calculation. "The deposit on a property of that caliber is significant, Silas. It is a high-risk play for a family dispute." "This is not a dispute. It is a market correction," I countered. "I am prepared to wire a 20% deposit within the next 10 minutes. I have already drafted the digital contract. I am not asking for a loan. I am offering you a seat at the most exclusive table in the Pacific Northwest." There was a pause, then a short, sharp laugh. "The student has become the strategist. The funds will be in your escrow account before your coffee is cold." With the capital secured, I pivoted to the brand identity of the event. I named it the Horizon Collective. This was not a family gathering. It was a high-level incubator for genuine connection. I selected a palette of deep indigo and brushed silver. In the psychology of branding, indigo represents intuition, integrity, and deep sincerity, a direct contrast to the frantic performative gold and red hues that Thatcher favored for his events. The brushed silver added a layer of modern industrial precision reflecting the metallic gray of the ocean below the estate. Every touchpoint from the digital invitations to the heavy textured paper of the welcome kits was designed to signal one thing: the future has arrived, and it is unapologetically refined. Then came the most critical task, the curation of the guest list. Thatcher had invited 156 people, a chaotic mix of distant cousins, social climbers, and friends who were merely social props. It was a crowd designed for noise and vanity, not impact. I did exactly the opposite. I curated a list of exactly 42 individuals. These were the true architects of change. The gallery curators who discovered the next generation of talent, the chief executive officers of ethical technology firms, and the venture capitalists who funded the dreams of the marginalized. I chose 42 people who held more collective power and genuine respect than the entire roster at Ironwood Hall. I sent the invitations through a secure encrypted portal. There were no +1s, and there was no filler. Each invitation was a personal acknowledgement of their excellence. Within 10 minutes of Alaric's confirmation, I executed the wire transfer. The digital receipt blinked on my screen, a 20% deposit that solidified my claim on Indigo Reach. I had moved more capital in a quarter of an hour than Thatcher usually approved in a fiscal quarter. By 9:00 a.m., the Indigo Reach estate was officially under my control for the duration of the retreat week. The confirmation email sat in my inbox like a digital scepter. I looked out at the Seattle skyline as the rain finally began to break, allowing a sliver of cold sunlight to hit the water. Thatcher was busy preparing for a crowd of 156 in a house that was slowly suffocating under the weight of its own history. I was preparing for 42 in a house made of light glass and transparency. The game had moved from the shadows of my studio to the heights of the cliffside. The narrative that there was not enough room was about to be obliterated by a reality they could not even imagine. I was no longer a son looking for a seat at the table. I was the founder who had built a better one. The air at Indigo Reach was different from the heavy, stagnant atmosphere of Ironwood Hall. Here, perched on the basalt cliffs, the wind felt like a clean slate. The glass walls of the estate offered a panoramic view of the Puget Sound, making the interior feel as though it were floating between the sky and the sea. I stood in the central gallery watching the light dance across the indigo-stained oak floors. Everything was in place. The brushed silver accents caught the afternoon sun, creating a space that was both formidable and welcoming. It was the physical manifestation of the brand I had spent years building, transparent, resilient, and undeniably modern. The silence was broken by the aggressive crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. I did not need to look at the security monitors to know who had arrived. The sound of a high-performance engine being revved unnecessarily was a signature of my twin brothers, Pierce and Knox. They did not visit. They invaded. I stepped back into the shadows of the corridor that led to my private study, signaling to Sloan to remain out of sight. I wanted to see exactly what Thatcher had sent them to do. They entered the main hall with a practiced air of entitlement, their expensive loafers clicking sharply against the stone. "Look at this place," Knox said, his voice dripping with a forced nonchalance. "Silas really thinks he is playing in the big leagues now. It is all a bit much, is it not? A bit too clinical." "It is a facade," Pierce replied. He was already holding his smartphone at chest height, subtly recording the layout of the room. "Father wants to know who is actually coming. He is convinced Silas is just fluffing the numbers to save face after being cut from the Ironwood roster." I watched from the doorway as they migrated toward my study. They moved with the frantic energy of people who knew they were trespassing but believed their last name made them immune to the consequences. When they reached my mahogany desk, their focus sharpened. My guest list, the curated 42, was laid out in a leather-bound folder. Beside it, my workstation was active, displaying a complex financial spreadsheet. Knox stood guard at the door, while Pierce began snapping high-resolution photos of the guest names. I could see the excitement in his eyes as he recognized the titles of the CEOs and curators I had secured. They were looking for leverage, a way to report back to Thatcher that I was overstepping my bounds. I decided it was time to provide them with exactly what they wanted, and a little more. I waited until Pierce reached for my laptop, which I had intentionally left unlocked. On the screen was a document titled Internal Invoice Project Horizon, Phase 1. It listed a staggering consultation fee of $750,000 payable to a private equity firm that did not exist. Pierce gasped, his thumb hovering over the screen as he took a burst of photos. "Knox, look at this. He is not just hosting a retreat, he is laundering money through a shell company. Father is going to lose his mind." "Do not stop there," Knox urged. "Check the browser history. Find out who is backing him." As Pierce navigated through the tabs, he became so absorbed in his digital espionage that he did not notice me stepping into the room. I leaned against the doorframe, my arms crossed. "Are you looking for the insurance binders or just the catering menu?" I asked, my voice as cold as the basalt walls. Both brothers jumped Pierce, nearly dropping his phone. Knox tried to recover his composure, adjusting the collar of his designer polo shirt. "Silas, we were just looking for you. The door was open." "The door was open, so you decided to photograph my private financial records and guest list." I walked toward them, the distance between us shrinking until they were backed against the glass wall. "I suppose Thatcher taught you that transparency only applies when you are the one holding the camera." "We are just worried about the family reputation, Silas," Pierce stammered, sliding his phone into his pocket. "Father thinks you are using the Sterling name to secure high-interest loans you cannot repay. We saw that invoice. $750,000. That is reckless even for you." "That invoice is a trap," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. "And you just walked right into it. I wonder how Thatcher will feel when he presents that evidence to the board, only to realize it leads to a dead end that makes him look like a paranoid amateur." In the heat of the confrontation, Pierce's personal laptop, which he had been carrying in a slim leather case, slid off the edge of the desk. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, the screen flickering to life upon impact. I moved faster than he could, picking up the device before he could grab it. "Give that back," Pierce demanded, his voice rising in pitch. "That is private property." I did not listen. My eyes were locked on the screen. He had been in the middle of a video call or a file transfer when they arrived. An open window displayed a document titled Omni Vantage Acquisition Strategy Ironwood East Wing. My heart stopped. The East Wing of Ironwood Hall was not just a collection of guest rooms. It housed the studio my grandfather had built for me, the space where I had spent my teenage years learning the craft of design, surrounded by Wilder Sterling's original sketches and tools. It was the only part of the estate that felt like home. I scrolled down. The document featured a logo I recognized instantly: Omni Vantage Hotels, a massive, soulless conglomerate known for turning historic properties into sterilized, high-priced tourist traps. Thatcher was not just hosting a retreat for stakeholders. He was preparing to sell my legacy to a corporation that would tear down the studio and replace it with a luxury spa. The betrayal was visceral. It was not just about lack of space. Thatcher was actively erasing my history while using my labor to pay the taxes on the very ground he was selling. He was cashing out on my childhood memories to fund his failing prestige. "You knew about this," I said, looking at Pierce and Knox. "You knew he was selling the studio." "It is a business decision, Silas," Knox said, regaining his arrogance. "The East Wing is dead weight. It does not generate revenue. OmniVantage is offering a premium because of the heritage factor. You should be happy. It keeps the rest of the estate solvent. He is selling my life's work to a hotel chain." I whispered, the weight of the discovery settling into my bones. "And he is using this retreat as a final networking event to close the deal." I closed the laptop and handed it back to Pierce. I was no longer angry. I was focused. The fire that had been simmering in my chest since I received that text message at 11:11 p.m. had turned into a cold, hard diamond of resolve. "Get out," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Silas, listen," Pierce started. "Get out of my house," I repeated, "and tell Thatcher to enjoy his 156 guests. Because by the time the sun sets on his retreat, the name Sterling is going to mean something very different than what he thinks." They did not argue further. They fled toward their SUV, the engine roaring as they sped away from Indigo Reach. I stood in my study surrounded by the scent of blackwood and sage and looked at the guest list of 42. My original plan was to build a table. My new plan was to ensure that the table at Ironwood Hall was dismantled piece by piece until Thatcher had nowhere left to sit. He wanted to sell my past. Fine. I would make sure he had no future in this industry. The storm outside Indigo Reach had reached a crescendo wind, howling against the reinforced glass panes like a trapped animal. Inside the atmosphere was a sharp contrast composed elegant and vibrating with the low hum of high-level discourse. My 42 guests, the true architects of the modern industry, were engaged in conversations that would likely shape the next decade of Pacific Northwest commerce. The scent of blackwood and sage was now layered with the delicate aroma of vintage Cabernet and cedar-smoked appetizers. The peace was shattered not by the storm, but by the heavy double doors of the main hall swinging open with a violent thud. Thatcher led the procession, his face a mask of calculated fury. Behind him stood Sutton, looking pale and regal in her charcoal cashmere, flanked by Pierce Knox and Blake. They did not enter as family, they entered as an inquisitional board. The conversation in the room died instantly. 42 of the most influential people in the country turned their heads in a synchronized motion, their eyes tracking the intruders. "Silas!" Thatcher bellowed, his voice echoing off the basalt walls. "Enough of this theatrical nonsense. You have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed." I stood my ground at the center of the gallery, a glass of mineral water in my hand. I did not move toward him. "You are interrupting a private event, Thatcher. I suggest you remember whose name is on the lease of this estate. Your name is on a lease funded by delusions." Thatcher marched into the center of the room, ignoring the elite crowd. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "You have spent years playing at being a designer while you drained the goodwill of the sterling name. And now you rent this glass cage to host a collective that is nothing more than a front for your financial incompetence. You are a reckless spender, Silas. You are squandering a legacy on vanity and spite." Sutton stepped forward, her voice a polished whisper that carried across the silent hall. "Silas, dear, please, stop this before you bankrupt yourself further. We know about the $750,000 invoice. We know you are in over your head. Come back to Ironwood Hall and let your father handle the damage control." The guests shifted. I could feel the weight of their scrutiny. Alaric Thorne, sitting in the front row, narrowed his eyes, waiting to see how I would navigate the ambush. Thatcher saw the hesitation and pressed his advantage. "You want to talk about tables, Silas? You do not even have a floor to stand on. Ironwood Hall is the only thing keeping your reputation alive, and you are biting the hand that feeds you. You are a financial liability to this family." I looked at Remy, who was standing quietly by the digital control hub near the basalt fireplace. I gave a single, imperceptible nod. "You are right about one thing, Thatcher," I said, my voice resonating with a calm that seemed to unnerve him. "This is about a legacy, but it is not the one you have been selling to the public." I turned my back to him and faced the massive projection wall that had moments ago been displaying the minimalist branding of the Horizon Collective. "Remy, if you please, let us look at the actual price of tradition." The screen hummed to life, but it did not show photos of the retreat or my portfolio. It displayed a high-resolution scan of a certified financial audit of Ironwood Hall. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The 42 guests leaned forward, their professional instincts immediately identifying the catastrophe on the screen. The ledger showed a staggering $4.2 million in unsecured debt. It showed the $12,000 tax payment I had made from my personal account highlighted in silver. And then the screen transitioned to the Omni Vantage Hotel's term sheet. "This," I said, gesturing to the glowing numbers, "is the reality of Ironwood Hall. While you were accusing me of being a reckless spender, you were quietly preparing to sell the sterling heritage to a hotel conglomerate to cover your own mismanagement. You did not exclude me from the retreat because of a lack of space. You excluded me because my grandfather's studio was the first asset you put on the auction block." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a dead-heavy silence that felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Thatcher's face transitioned from a fiery red to a sickly ashen gray. He looked at the screen, then at the guests, the very people he had spent his life trying to impress. These were individuals who valued one thing above all else: transparency. And they were now looking at a man who was exposed as a fraud. I saw Alaric Thorne stand up. He did not look at me. He looked directly at Thatcher. "Thatcher," Alaric said, using my father's formal name with a tone of utter dismissal, I believe your liquidity issue is far more permanent than you led us to believe. Silas is not the liability here, you are." Sutton looked as though she had been struck. Pierce and Knox stepped back, trying to distance themselves from the radioactive aura of their father's failure. "I covered your taxes, Thatcher," I said, my voice cutting through the stillness. "I offered you loyalty. You offered me a $15 gift card and an eviction notice from my own history. You came here to teach me a lesson about tradition. But the only tradition you represent is the slow decay of a name that used to mean something." I stepped toward the screen and closed the file. The room remained in that haunting silence. The Elite 42 were no longer looking at the Sterlings as a dynasty. They were looking at them as a cautionary tale. "The meeting is over," I said quietly. "Remy, please show our guests the way to the lounge. My family and I have some private matters to conclude." Thatcher did not move. He stood in the center of my indigo reach, surrounded by the glass and steel of a future he could not comprehend, destroyed by the very transparency he had tried to weaponize against me. The table had been built, the truth had been served, and for the first time in my life I was the only one left standing. The guests had drifted toward the lounge, their voices a distant low tide against the shore of our confrontation. Thatcher remained standing in the center of the hall, his shadow elongated by the flickering firelight, looking like a monument to a kingdom that had already fallen. The silence was no longer empty. It was heavy with the debris of the truth I had just detonated. The heavy rhythmic thud of the side door opening drew our attention. Marin stepped into the light. She was dressed in a simple deep navy coat, her presence bringing a sudden grounded authority to the room. In her hands, she carried a thick, cream-colored envelope, its edges softened by years of careful storage. "It is time, Silas," Marin said, her gaze steady. Thatcher found his voice, though it was thin and brittle. "Marin, whatever you think you are doing, this is family business. Leave us." "I am the only one here doing family business, Thatcher," Marin replied. She turned to me, but before she could speak, my mother Sutton stepped forward. The pale, distant mask she had worn all evening finally cracked. She did not look at Thatcher. She looked at me with an intensity I had not seen since I was a child. I am the one who called her Silas. I am the one who told her about the Omni Vantage deal. I am the one who ensured you had the financial audit of Ironwood Hall. The revelation hit the room like a second shockwave. Pierce and Knox looked at their mother as if she were a stranger. Thatcher reached out to grab her arm, but she stepped back with a chilling elegance. "I have watched you dismantle our history to feed your ego for 30 years, Thatcher." "Sutton," said her voice a sharp, clear blade. "I could not stop you from selling the East Wing, but I could ensure that the person Wilder actually trusted had the weapons to fight back. I have been Silas's silent partner from the moment you sent that text message." Marin handed me the envelope. The paper felt remarkably heavy, possessing a tactile gravity that seemed to anchor me to the floor. I slid my thumb under the wax seal, a crest featuring a compass and an oak leaf. Then I opened it. The sound was extraordinary. In the acoustic perfection of the basalt hall, the crisp, sharp snap of the parchment unfolding was amplified. It was a dry, textured sound, the rustle of decades-old wisdom finally finding the air. To my ears, it was not just the sound of paper. It was the sound of a cage door swinging open. It was the sound of freedom. I began to read the handwritten words of Wilder Sterling. The ink was a deep faded indigo matching the very walls of the estate I had built. "To my grandson Silas," the letter began. "I know the man my son Thatcher has become. He is a curator of appearances, a man who values the gilded frame more than the canvas itself. I knew he would eventually see Ironwood Hall not as a home, but as a currency. Therefore, I have established the Sterling Horizon Trust." I looked up at Thatcher, whose eyes were wide with a growing, frantic realization. I continued reading. "This trust contains the entirety of the Sterling family's liquid capitala fund, separate from the physical estate of Ironwood Hall. However, the mandate for its release is specific. It cannot be accessed by blood right alone. It can only be triggered when Silas Sterling proves he can gather a community of true influence, a table of his own making, without the assistance, the name, or the capital of his father. The moment Silas creates a sanctuary that values substance over status, the trust shall be his. Marin stepped forward, her voice ringing with legal finality. The Horizon Collective, hosted here at Indigo Reach, is the documented proof required by the Trust. By inviting 42 of the most significant minds in the industry and securing their presence through your own merit, Silas, you have fulfilled Wilder's final wish. As of this moment, you are the sole trustee of the Sterling Capital. The atmospheric shift was palpable. The air felt lighter, as if the suffocating pressure of Thatcher's expectations had been sucked out of the room. I was no longer the excluded son begging for a seat. I was the gatekeeper of the very wealth Thatcher had spent his life mismanaging. Thatcher collapsed into one of the brushed silver chairs, his head in his hands. He was a man who had tried to sell the past to save his present, only to find that the past had been waiting to disinherit him all along. "You had the information all along, Sutton," Thatcher whispered. "I had the truth, Thatcher," she replied, walking over to stand beside me and Marin. "And for the first time in this family, the truth is not for sale." I looked down at the parchment in my hands. The scent of old ink and cedar rose from the pages. I had built my own table just as Wilder had commanded, and in doing so I had found that the table was not just a place to sit, it was a platform to stand on. The morning arrived with a silence so profound it felt structural. The storm had rinsed the sky, leaving behind a vast expanse of pale sapphire that mirrored the stillness of the Puget Sound. At Indigo Reach, the glass walls were no longer barriers against the wind, but lenses focusing the first light of dawn onto the basalt floors. The air was crisp, carrying the faint, clean scent of salt water and damp earth. I gathered my family in the central gallery one final time. There were no guests, no cameras, and no performance. Thatcher sat at the end of the long indigo oak table, his posture slumped, the fire of his previous night's rage replaced by the cold ash of realization. Pierce and Knox stood behind him, their usual arrogance replaced by a frantic, whispered consultation. Blake stared at his phone, likely calculating the legal fallout of a trust fund he could no longer touch. I stood at the head of the table, not as a son seeking approval, but as the trustee of the Sterling future. I placed the original parchment from Wilder's Sterling in the center of the wood, the indigo ink glowing in the morning light. "The time for negotiation has ended," I began, my voice steady and devoid of the tremors of resentment. "Thatcher, you have spent 30 years treating this family like a commodity. You have 48 hours to make a choice. Here are my terms." The room grew even quieter. I saw my father flinch at the word terms. "First, you will formally withdraw from the Omni Vantage acquisition. My grandfather's studio and the east wing of Ironwood Hall are no longer for sale. They will be placed into a permanent cultural land trust managed by the Horizon Collective. Second, I will use the Sterling Horizon Trust to clear the $4.2 million in debt currently suffocating the estate. However, in exchange, you will sign over all operational and scheduling authority of Ironwood Hall to me. It will no longer be a playground for your networking. It will become a sanctuary for the makers you once ignored." "You are disinheriting your own father," Thatcher whispered, looking up with hollow eyes. "No," I replied. "I am protecting the legacy you were prepared to burn for a quick exit. You have 48 hours to sign the transition documents. If you refuse, I will freeze all disbursements from the trust. I will initiate a legal injunction against the Omni Vantage deal based on Wilder's addendum, and you will face the creditors alone. The choice is yours." Before Thatcher could respond, a chair scraped against the floor. Lyra stood up. She had spent most of the week in the shadows observing the carnage with her artist's eye. She walked toward me, her footsteps echoing with a newfound confidence. "I am staying here," Lyra said, her voice small but unbreakable. "I want to be a part of what Silas is building. I am done pretending that the curated lies at Ironwood Hall are a substitute for a real life. I am choosing the horizon." Sutton rose next. She did not say a word. She simply walked to the side of the table where I stood, placing her hand on my shoulder. Her silence was the most powerful public statement she had ever made. She was not just siding with the son, she was siding with the truth she had helped preserve. Thatcher looked at his wife and his daughter, then at the twin sons who were already looking for an escape hatch. He looked like a man who had realized that his table was finally empty. 48 hours, I repeated. I did not wait for his answer. I turned and walked out of the gallery through the glass doors and down the stone path that led toward the private dock. The descent was peaceful. The frantic energy of the last few days had evaporated, leaving behind a deep, resonant clarity. I reached the edge of the water and sat on a weathered basalt bench. The sound was a sheet of hammered silver ripples moving in slow, rhythmic pulses against the shore. For the first time in my life, I did not feel the weight of the sterling name. I did not feel the sting of the $15 gift card or the hollow ache of being told that there was no room. I realized that Indigo Reach was never just about a house or a retreat. It was a symbol of the internal architecture I had built within myself. It was the physical proof that when you are excluded from someone else's sanctuary, you do not just survive, you create something better. I watched a lone heron glide across the horizon, its silhouette sharp against the morning mist. I felt no hatred for Thatcher. Hatred requires an investment of energy that I was no longer willing to give him. I felt only a quiet, profound stillness. I had built my own table. I had filled it with people who valued substance over status. And in doing so, I had finally found my way home. The rain in Seattle was a memory. The storm at the lake was over. The sun was up, and for the first time I could see exactly where I was going. Have you ever been excluded by your own family or made to feel like you did not belong at the very table you helped build? Tell me your story in the comments. I love knowing how far these stories reach. Sometimes, even the smallest connection makes a story feel heard. Thank you for listening. If you are new here, please consider subscribing. This channel is where I share real stories, raw, unfiltered, and straight from the heart. Every like, comment, and subscribe helps me keep telling them, especially on the days when it feels hardest.